Hello and welcome to the online digital platform Discourse, an archive of ideas. This series by the Economic Society of Shriram College of Commerce is an attempt to support and rekindle the growth of ideas and opinions among students. Through this platform, we invite distinguished personalities from various fields to discuss relevant ideas and provide the youth with a better understanding of the world around them. For this episode, we are honored to have amongst us Mr. Rajiv Kher. During the ongoing trade wars between USA and China, we know that India followed a policy of non-alignment, right? But according to the recent sources that have shown that India will benefit from this trade war that's going on between US and China, do you think India should still take a stand of non-alignment if we are actually benefiting and if we can actually encourage better relationships with both these sides?
Well, see, this the concept of non-alignment is not very conducive to the growth of trade.
Okay.
And just to keep the matter straight, India has not been non-aligned in this conflict because, as a matter of fact, this was a bilateral conflict. This bilateral conflict originated out of many things, and it is not simply a matter of bilateral economic policies between the US and China, but the root cause goes into the geostrategy and geopolitics of the world as today. So India is not non-aligned or aligned either way, because the reasons were bilateral, and primarily here trade policy, US has used the trade policy as an instrument of ongoing geostrategic power dynamics. So that was just to clarify the understanding.
Yeah.
Now, well, yes, India can benefit a lot from this trade conflict which is going on. There is a small truce at the moment with US and China agreeing on a so-called trade deal. But clearly this is not going to settle down,
Yeah.
because as I said, the root cause here is not necessarily bilateral trade issues alone, but whole lot of other strategic issues. And what the two countries are trying to do between themselves is just trying to see who's the one up.
Yeah.
The opportunities will come India's way. They have already come India's way. And what India needs to see is how to translate those opportunities into real action. Now, clearly, there are a whole lot of American companies which are under acute pressure in China because of variety of reasons which have been spoken, to move their production systems not out of China, but also add another location to their production system. Now, whoever will offer the best opportunities for these investments is where the investments will go. So there are many in the line, countries like Vietnam, for example, countries like Bangladesh, country like India. They are all in the game.
Yeah.
How fast and how cogent and how good industrial policies and the rest of the sectoral policies can be put together will determine as to how much of that investment can come into India.
India has had free trade agreements in the past. For example, the India-Japan CEPA, the India-Korea CEPA. But these actually haven't worked in India's favor. The imports have been higher than the exports. So what could be the reason behind this, and what should be India's way forward? Should India continue with free trade agreements, and if not, what should be the way forward?
You see, a free trade agreement, simply what does it mean? In the normal course, as we understand free trade agreements, the two countries or a group of countries, they come together and they negotiate tariffs, the import duties, and the import duties from their existing level are reduced. So wherever you reduce the tariffs, it is easier for imports, because the value of the product has gone down because of the lesser import duty, and you get a the other country gets a market access. Same happens for us also. So now there is this huge discourse going on that India's FTAs have not helped India. Well, it is true to the extent that the benefit which India has derived out of these many of these free trade agreements is not as much as the trading partner has derived.
Yeah.
To that extent, you may be right. But that does not mean that the trade agreement itself as a concept is bad. This only shows that either we did not negotiate a good deal. What we should have negotiated maybe that product is not there, number one. Two, it could be that we negotiated all right, but in the foreign markets, there are what is called the non-tariff barriers. Now, non-tariff barriers normally are regulatory barriers. For example, you may be making this pen, you may be exporting it to another market, and another market has standards around this pen, which are standards which are scientifically unjustified. Now, there are certain norms for the standards according to the WTO law. So some country has adopted standards which are impossible to be followed. So obviously the country may have still brought down the tariff and given me market access. But if the standards are not good enough, standards are high enough, I will not be able to enter. Or the procedure is so prescribed that my people are not able to come around that procedure. So there may be non-tariff barriers to my trade. And the third thing is, see, very often it is believed that FTA, once you have negotiated, you have achieved everything. Actually, that's completely wrong. FTA is only an institutional framework. After all, at the heart of all this still lies the fact that you should be competitive. So if you are not competitive, then you may have the best of FTAs.
Exactly.
But you can only take advantage of the tariff duty. And now in most countries, which are trading countries, the tariffs have become very small. See, 2.5%, 2%, 4, 5%. No country has more than this. Countries like India, or for that matter some other developing countries, also have high tariffs. So it is very often said that India is sacrificing more than the others. India is bound to sacrifice more because India's tariffs are higher. So you will have to bring down the tariffs more than your trading partner, which has a lower tariff. So it will bring lesser. So it is not simply the reduction of tariff and the amount of sacrifice that each country makes, but it is also the other elements of negotiation which are important. For example, the non-tariff barrier or the trade facilitation issues, logistics related issues, availability of credit. You may have the best of market, but your small producer doesn't have access to credit. If he doesn't have access to credit, he may have an order in his hands, 5 million pieces, 5 lakh pieces, but he has no money.
He's not able to produce.
So unless we deal with this whole ecosystem of international trade, merely an FTA itself cannot help. FTA is simply a mechanism to open the door in a country, but you will be able to enter that door only when you walk up to that door.
We have seen in the past, and we are seeing it even today, that WTO agreements have forced developing countries to open up their economies. However, the developed economies continue to sort of use certain amount of protectionism and protect their industries. What are your views on the fairness of the WTO conducts and how it conducts its activities?
See, WTO is a multilateral mechanism, and when it was negotiated, the whole idea was to provide a certain predictable rule-based mechanism for all members so that there could be free trade, free and fair trade. That was the basic objective. Now, clearly, when it started, it had much lesser number. Today, we have 164 members of the WTO. There are 3 kinds of countries amongst the members. One are the developed countries, the other are developing countries, and the third are the least developed countries. Now, all agreements have no obligations on the least developed countries. They have access to the other markets, but they don't have any obligation to perform. So, to that extent, they are not bound by certain discipline. They may be adversely affected because of their relative lack of capacities, the supply side capacity. They don't have the points I was making earlier, resources, they don't have skills, they don't have resources, the material resources, they don't have manufacturing investments in their country, and consequently, though there is a potential possible, but they are not able to take advantage of that. So LDCs can face these kinds of issues. Now, clearly in an agreement, the terms of trade cannot be said to be vitiated by this kind of a situation. But the terms of trade are vitiated in an agreement where you find that developed countries have been able to secure for themselves provisions which on the face of it might appear innocuous, but actually help only a certain kind of country. Now, if you look at any of the agreements, look at the agreement on agriculture, look at any of the agreements. For example, look at the agreement of agriculture issue on subsidies.
Right.
Now, one of the points of subsidies is that only those countries which on the day of the agreement of agriculture notified their domestic subsidies are allowed to give subsidies. Now, by very definition, this is a biased provision, because when the agreement of agriculture was signed, how many countries were in a position to give subsidies? They were only the big ones, the European Union and the United States and others. So they were giving subsidies, so they notified. So they are allowed to give subsidies to that extent. A country like India was not allowed. Because not allowed means a country like India was not giving subsidies, so it did not notify. And because it did not notify, you can assume it to be not allowed. So a country like India is governed by what is called the de minimis concept. De minimis is that you are allowed a certain percentage of your total production of a product as subsidy. So if you produce, let's say, X amount of rice, 10% of that you can give as subsidy. This is the way it all happened. Now, in order to calculate whether you are within that 10% limit or outside that 10% limit, a formula has been put in the agreement on agriculture, which takes the base value as the price of rice in the year 1986 to 88, the average price of 86 to 88. Now, imagine if today you calculate the price, the subsidy that India gives on rice procurement based on the price that prevailed in 1986-88. What about the inflation over these 40 years? So you are not inflating that price. So any day, any country like India, or for that matter, any country would be seen as exceeding more than 10%. Because the value of subsidy will become more.
Right, sir.
So this is now clearly, as the point you were making, that this is discriminatory.
Right, sir.
Now nobody is discriminating against India or Africa, but the provision is such that it becomes discriminatory against the developing countries. So these are the kinds of provisions which exist in the WTO agreement which become discriminatory, and therefore developing countries from time to time, and in Doha round actually particularly these were the kinds of issues which we were addressing.
Right, sir.
But unfortunately that round has not moved. And if you are familiar with this whole dimension of food security, you know there is something called Bali Agreement about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, no 7 years ago. Finally WTO negotiated an agreement where countries which were giving subsidies, that developing countries, was protected through what is called a peace clause. That means if I am giving subsidy more than, let's say, 10%, that will be protected on the number of products which I have already notified. So this is the way we have been able to come around the kind of concern that you expressed. But you are right that all agreements have something or the other which has some bias, and this bias against developing countries. And the reasons go, back to the political economy of the world. Obviously, in the year 94, 95, countries like India, China, and many others were not in a position to negotiate a good deal for themselves. So they did negotiate. But clearly, the US and European Union were in a much better position, both in terms of their capacity as well as in terms of their political strength to negotiate a good deal. And therefore, a lot many provisions of these agreements are such which can be seen to be biased in their favor.
Sir, in the 2020 budget, recently the government has increased the import duty on e-vehicles. So, given that e-vehicles are the way forward, do you think that this is the right step, given that India does not have enough infrastructure to boost the Make in India campaign, that the government has justified this policy?
See, one of the manufacturing strategy can be to provide protection to a given sector by means of tariffs, incubate that sector, make investments in that sector, bring technology, and let it come to a level where it can be globally competitive, and then remove the tariff protection. So this has been used as a strategy by many countries, developed countries as well, and India has used it in the automobile sector itself. In the 1990s, we created what is called the Automotive Mission Plan, and we protected our automobile sector by raising the duties very high, 100%, and 150% also at some point. So because of the high duties, imports were shut down, but we facilitated investments. So what we did actually was we invited investments, did not invite imports, and because the Indian market was big, therefore these people came and made investments, and gradually we incubated technology and all that. And today, our automobile sector has come up very well. So this strategy has worked. Now the difference between this strategy and the EV sector strategy that you mentioned about is the following. You can increase the tariff, so exactly the same thing is being replicated. The problem is that we may still not be in a position of being well prepared to manufacture electric vehicles in India. For example, what is the biggest component of electric vehicle? The battery.
Right.
Now, we still don't have a battery manufacturing facility. I think some facility is coming, Maruti Suzuki is putting up a facility. But we don't have, there is a calculation of the kind of battery requirement that India would have over the period of time. But still we don't have large investments which have come into battery making. Now, in such a situation, if you go back to the policy which was a few years ago brought out, not policy but the kind of statements which came, that we will have electric vehicles replacing all the vehicles by some year. And that was completely unacceptable, because if you don't have batteries, if you don't have manufacturing capacity, how would you do that? So the government has corrected that, and now you have correspondingly you have increased your emission standards to BS6. So what the government is doing is making a comprehensive policy. What that policy is, the underlying thought is cut down the carbon footprint. In order to cut down the carbon footprint, one, reduce emissions. In order to reduce emission, improve standards, emission standards. So BS6 in petrol and diesel. Correspondingly, also bring in electric vehicles, because the world is moving to that direction, and in terms of carbon footprints is far more conducive. So in order to let people make electric vehicles, at one point we were talking in terms of a complete replacement, but not anymore. We are talking of a gradual introduction of electric vehicles, both hybrid as well as pure electric vehicles. So broadly, if you look at it in a comprehensive sense, the policy may make sense.